Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sean Fine. I'm the CEO of the Irish Bioenergy Association, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the webinar number 26 in the Irish Bioenergy Association webinar series. And the title of this morning's webinar is Transport in Ireland, a Pathway to Halving Emissions. This morning, we'll focus on our transport report, which was recently launched. Just a very brief outline of what we do as part of our organisation for any new participants that we haven't had on our webinar series before. So we're established in 1999. We're the representative body for the bioenergy industry in the island of Ireland. And we cover the sectors of biomass, biogas, biofuels, biochar, wood fuels and energy crops. We have a diverse range of activities, including policy, lobbying and advocacy, knowledge transfer, and we have a broad and diverse membership covering all aspects of the sector. We also roll out a number of research and development projects, and our website address is available, www.irbea.org, for you to check out further details of our organisation. This is webinar number 26 in our webinar series. We've had a broad and extensive series of webinars to date, starting back in late 2020 through 2021 and continuing into 2022. And if you would like to review any of these webinars which have taken place, feel free to access them through our website or indeed through our YouTube channel. If you would like to participate and to present at a webinar, please send myself or Teresa O'Brien, my colleague in the association, an email, and we'd be happy to or get in touch with us by phone, whichever is easiest for you, and we would be happy to discuss further what your proposed topic would be, and happy to engage on that. Today's webinar is webinar number 26, as I said. So our main presentation this morning will be from Dr. Paul Deane from UCC MaREI. We'll also have feedback and a panel discussion with Paddy Phelan, our IrBEA President and CEO of 3CEA, James Cogan, Ethanol Europe, Tony Hennebry, Green Biofuels Ireland, and Teresa Patton, Green Generation. And I thank all our speakers and panelists for joining us and taking time out of their busy schedules to be part of this morning's discussion. We will also have a panel discussion, and then we will take any questions that you have. So if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them to the Q&A tab on the bottom of our screen. Just a reminder, our next webinar, number 27, will take place on the 2nd of February from 9:30 to 10:30, and full details are published in the coming days through our social media channels. This morning's, and the last slide for me before I hand over to Paul, is detailing our report, Transport in Ireland, a Pathway to Halving Emissions. This report was commissioned by the Irish Bioenergy Association and developed by UCC MaREI. And thanks very much to Dr. Paul Deane and all his team for their work and efforts in putting together this report. It was launched in early December 2021 and covers all fuels, technology and measures required to halve transport emissions by 2030. And that in essence means that we need to get to 35% renewables in transport by 2030. And I would like to acknowledge the contributions made by our sponsors of the report, Transport Infrastructure Ireland, Ethanol Europe, Green Biofuels Ireland, 3CEA and Green Generation. So Paul, it's over to you to give us an outline of the report, and I look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thanks very much, Sean. I'm just going to share my screen now, folks, and let me bring it up here. Sean, will you give me a shout there if you can see that?
We can indeed, Paul. Yes, indeed. We can.
Great. Thanks very much, Sean. Good morning, everybody. I hope everybody's well. And thanks very much, Sean and IrBEA and all the for you all online for tuning in this morning. I hope you've had a chance to read this report. Actually, it was a report that we spent a lot of time on, and it's a very readable report. Actually, you know what I'll do for this presentation, because I want to leave as much time as we have for Q&A and for hearing the industry panel, which I often feel brings a lot of value. So rather than go through bits and pieces that are already in the report, I'll leave as much time as we can for discussion. But what I will do this morning is I want to bring your attention to 3 specific slides or 3 specific pages within the report that I would like to draw your attention to, and I'll focus on those. And again, we put a lot of effort in trying to make the report readable. You know, it's aimed at the curious reader, really. If you're interested about transport, if you're interested about bioenergy, and if you're interested about climate change, you know, we'd hope that you'd find this report easy to read, easy to digest, and hopefully to understand. And a huge thanks to all my colleagues here in MaREI for helping me put this report together. I was kind of reflecting on this report this morning, and I really enjoyed doing the report for a number of reasons. Number one, transport is a huge challenge for Ireland. It's our largest source of energy emissions. And it's growing, you know, it's a huge growing, and and many would feel, and I think we've heard this sentiment echoed by Minister Ryan as well recently, that transport is probably Ireland's greatest climate challenge in reducing our emissions. And of course, what we looked at in this report is how can we halve those emissions between now and 2030. But what I enjoyed doing the report, I really enjoyed the stakeholder engagement. As an academic, I found actually the rich stakeholder engagement that we had from IrBEA members, just very rich, very useful. It's fascinating sometimes, you know, when you're working this stuff at a high level, at a national picture, to listen to what's happening on the ground, to listen to some of the optimism, the ambition, but also the frustration, you know. And I suppose if I was to pick out something that I didn't like doing in this report, and it kind of comes back to me now and again, is that I suppose it was a constant reminder of just how hard a challenge transport is going to be. I'm very worried about our progress on emissions reduction in Ireland. I'm very worried about climate change. I'm very worried that we're not doing enough. And I'm very worried at a lot of the ambitious rhetoric that we're hearing at the moment from across policy circles, which is at odds with the pace of emissions reductions that we're achieving. And it's also at odds with a lot of the big challenges that we are facing right across the full energy system. So that's a kind of a constant worry, really. I suppose when I do these reports, you see how hard things are, and then you see a lot of these things which just aren't being discussed at a policy level, which unfortunately, which really needs to change. But before I jump into the slide that you're looking at here at the moment, there's kind of two things that I'd like you to take as readers. You know, and the first thing is that you know, we often kind of pitch this role for bioenergy in transport versus electric vehicles. And I don't see that competition at all, you know. Even if we do, and this is one of the findings in this report, even if we do everything we can with electric vehicles, let's just say we hit that hugely ambitious target of 1 million EVs on the road by 2030. Let's just say we have a huge increase in biomethane production for heavy transport. We have a huge increase from E10 from E5 to E10, from B7 to B12. That's still nowhere near enough to get us near the level of ambition that we set ourselves in Ireland. So I don't like this competition that we often set the electrification of transport versus of biofuels. There is no competition. They are both needed. And again, as I said, even if we both do everything, we can, it still won't be enough. And we must remember that electrification of transport is important, but if we electrify 1 million cars in 2030, there's still another million plus that will still be using fossil fuels. And of course, bioenergy is something that is incredible at diluting the emissions content of those fuels and reducing emissions. The second thing I'd like to bring your attention to is emissions. Now, if you look up at the slide that we have on the screen here in front of you, look up at the top right hand corner. Let me just move my camera out of the way there. Biofuels last year avoided over 500,000 tons of CO2 emissions. That's incredible. To give that in comparison to where we are with electric vehicles were somewhere around 15,000. So you've got 500,000 versus 15,000. And of course, all the policy focus is on electricity, and that's needed, it's necessary, but we've kind of fallen in love with the story of electricity, and it's blinding us to a lot of the things that are necessary from a policy perspective. It's blinding us to the things that are successful, and it's blinding us to things that are working very well in Ireland. And what works very well in Ireland, wind energy works very well in Ireland, and our biofuel obligation scheme works very well in Ireland, delivering those significant 500,000 tons of CO2 emissions last year. Now, for years here in UCC, myself and my colleagues were always complaining that, look, we focus too much on renewable energy in Ireland, we focus too much on targets, we need to talk about emissions. But now I'm changing this, and what I'd like us all to think about in Ireland is not just about emissions, but the cumulative emissions savings. Because in Ireland, what we have now is we don't have emissions targets per se anymore. We don't have renewable energy targets, particularly at a European level. We don't have those anymore. What's really important is that we have carbon budgets, and carbon budgets are solely important because they reflect the cumulative emissions savings coming from policy measures. So what I'd love people to think about, policy people, people in industry, think about the cumulative saving of your idea. Think about the cumulative saving of something like biofuels. So last year we avoided 500,000 tons of CO2 emissions over a 10-year period. That's 5 million tons of CO2 will be avoided. And that's the way we need to start thinking about emissions reductions in Ireland, the cumulative benefit. And when you look at things in terms of the cumulative benefit, you see that small changes that are done now actually over a long period of time deliver significant emissions reductions. And this is one of the challenges with a policy focus for transport that's very narrowly focused on electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are necessary, they're important, we have to do it, but most of those emission savings actually will come very much later in the decade when sales of EVs ramped up. And that's just not good enough because it doesn't deliver the cumulative emission savings that we need over this decade. And this is one of the really wonderful things about biofuels. You know, they're shovel ready, they're ready to go, and they're already delivering projects. So again, if you think about going from E5 to E10 or B7 to B12 or HVO or B20, think about the cumulative emissions benefits. And that's really, really important. And that's one of the things that this report is very strong at. You know, we look at the emissions and those cumulative benefits. And cumulative emissions are really important because that's what climate change is all about. It's not the emissions at some point in time that are important. It's not something like the emissions in 2050 that are important or the emissions in 2030. It's actually the cumulative emissions between now and then. And of course, we have very strict carbon budgets across a global level. We have very strict carbon budgets here in Ireland. The other thing that I found really fascinating with this slide here, and even we threw it up, we kind of road tested this slide with a number of students here. You know, people are fascinated by the success in bio liquids, particularly already in transport, you know, because when people think about transport, you know, and even just asking a few friends around here, think about transport, think about renewable transport, we think about electricity, but that's not the case. You know, sustainable biofuels accounted for 98% plus of renewable energy in transport, and the rest was renewable electricity. And actually, the rest of that renewable electricity was primarily, most of that actually was in things like the Lewis and the Dart, and not so much in EVs. So again, we fall in love with the story of EVs, which is necessary, but it's blinding ourselves to things that are working. It's blinding ourselves to the things that are necessary, and it's blinding ourselves to the things that we need to do. And of course, throughout this report as well, what we see is, you know, Ireland has huge strengths to play on when it comes to bioenergy, not only looking at bioliquids, but internally from looking at our own, particularly biomethane reduction. So the next slide that I'd like to bring your attention to then is, so that's the emissions part, which is really important. And remember, we must move away from this idea that these things are in competition with each other. We need everything we can. And if we do everything we can with renewable transport, it won't be enough. We still need huge societal buy-in in taking public transport, in walking more, in having less trips, in buying way more efficient cars. So technology will only get us so far. We also need, there's a huge people component to this as well as the policy component. And then we might have some chance of getting anywhere near our targets for transport in Ireland. The second slide that I'd like to bring your attention to is, let me just try and move this down here, is this slide here, the key messages. And again, if you're familiar with the report, you probably have you know, you've seen these already. And, you know, and what we found, this analysis, look, the EV target that the government have is massively ambitious, and, you know, people will say it's not realistic, or it's this or it's that, but it's kind of what we need to do. You know, if we're serious about reducing our emissions by half, we're going to have to do some incredibly ambitious things. Now, having ambition is one thing, but delivering on that action is another thing, and following it through with strong policy is really, really important. So yes, the EVs are necessary, but they're only a small part of the story. And actually later on in this report, if you look down on one of the slides, I think slide 17 or something later, we talk about the role of EVs and biofuels. In fact, what they will do is just offset the growth in economic activity that comes from transport emissions over the next 10 years. So in many ways, we need to run very fast just to stand still, because as the economy recovers from COVID, and we know this from the past in Ireland, economic activity is very much linked to transport emissions in Ireland. And the more active the economy tends to be in Ireland, the more the emissions increase in Ireland. So it's not just about reducing our emissions cumulatively between now and 2030, it's also reducing the growth, the expected growth in emissions. And that makes transport particularly tricky and particularly challenging in Ireland. The other thing we came up with, option 2 there, or measure 2, is, and this has been the climate action plan again, you know, increasing bioethanol and biodiesel blending and bringing that forward. That's really important because that ties into the cumulative emissions saving. So waiting is not an option when it comes to climate action in Ireland. Waiting is not a strategy when it comes to climate action in Ireland. We have to look at things that are ready to go and do them as much as we can and as quickly as we can. If you can bring forward the blending of E10 and B12 forward by 1 year, that's maybe 200,000 to 300,000 emissions extra savings that come off your carbon budget. That's significant. You have to sell an awful lot of EVs. You have to get an awful lot of people to pick buses, transport, e-scooters, etc., to get anywhere near those types of savings. So in many ways, we're doing a lot of things. Like, it's easy to be critical with the government, but in all honesty, I have a lot of sympathy for them, because this is really, really hard, and we're doing a lot of the right things, but we're not doing them at a scale that's sufficient enough to mark our ambition. And we're not doing them at a time enough that's there to mark the urgency in climate change. That's fundamentally important, really, when we're thinking about particularly transport. The other thing that we came up with in these, look at the number, I spoke about, behavioral issues are really, really important. And biomethane, is huge. This is one of the things that, that we've been looking at UCC for time and time again. And people often think, saying to the folks online before we came here, people often kind of think, oh, geez, that's something that we chose to champion in UCC. But it's not. It just reflects the scientific evidence, and it reflects the strengths of the resource that we have here in Ireland in the potential to develop renewable gas, to develop biomethane. And biomethane is fundamentally important, because we think a lot of transport about cars, we think a little bit about vans, but it's trucks, heavy transport. If you have a concrete mixer carrying, it's a 40-ton load, a gross payload on a road, these things are very, very hard to electrify, And people often say, look, sure, we'll have the hydrogen economy in 2 or 3 decades. We can't wait. Right? Waiting is not an option. We need to do these things now. We need to look at our strengths and looking at the biomethane potential that we have here in Ireland. And I suppose at a personal level, I often find this very frustrating, because I think we have a very false ideological stance against anything bio in Ireland. Now, some of that I think relates to the terrible actual destruction and reputational destruction that palm oil debacle, that palm oil mess down in Indonesia and in Malaysia, which caused real damage. The sustainability criteria are fundamentally important there. But we need to look at a really strict sustainability criteria, bringing those together. And also what we found in this report is, and this came up a lot with the stakeholder engagement as well, it's also about actually enforcing the sustainability criteria that are already in place. So we don't really need new legislation. We just need to be brave and enforce the legislation that's there as well. And maybe James and some of the panel will talk about that really. And that was one of the things I suppose I found very refreshing discussions that we had with IrBEA members, the need for sustainability criteria, because that transparency leads to trust, that transparency leads to strong policy, and that transparency leads to the emissions reduction, and that's fundamentally important. Now, there is a thing in Ireland that we tend to apply a kind of a different level of sustainable integrity to biofuels and not so much into EVs, but this goes right across the board. This is about everything for all parts of the energy transition. We need to be careful about components for battery elements for EVs. We need to be careful about the labor, about the minerals. We apply it naturally very quickly to bioenergy, but it needs to be applied right across the board. And every type of renewable energy needs to be held to that standard. It is really, really important. But bioenergy is one of those things, biomethane in particular, is one of those things that I find frustrating, not only for that kind of ideological stance that we seem to have against it, but also when you look at other countries that are doing really, really well in renewable transport. And I'll talk about this in a minute. When you look at the UK, look at Germany, look at Austria, when you look at the potential that we have in Ireland to grow grass, when you look at the excess slurries, and when you look at the huge potential and huge frustration within the farming community around Ireland for particularly smaller farming families who are looking for options to diversify, different ways to use their land, different ways to earn a living, different cooperative movements, and when you look at the energy security issues that we have in Ireland, biomethane, bioenergy is just one of those things that ticks a lot of boxes. Yes, we need to be so careful with sustainability criteria, but being worried about not being able to enforce sustainability criteria is not a reason to do nothing. We need to do this because biomethane, not only does it tick those boxes, I said, in terms of farming options, manure management, fertilizer management, land use management, but it also allows us to get into those very difficult to decarbonize areas, such as heavy transport. And heavy transport trucks are a huge challenge in Ireland, because even if there is a huge breakthrough in electrification from electrification technology, trucks are going to be really, really difficult to decarbonize. And given the targets that we have, not only do we need to reduce emissions from vans and cars and public transport, but we also need to get serious with heavy transport as well. And on my last slide, before we hand back to Sean and before we hand back to the panel discussion, I'd like to scroll down to the report and talk to one of the things I found very interesting, and I suppose I learned a lot while doing this report as well, was looking at other countries, because often we feel in Ireland that we're kind of doing something that nobody has ever done before, but that's not the case. And I found this curious when we kind of road tested this in UCC with some of the students. If you ask anyone, you know, who are the leaders in renewable transport in the world? People will always say Norway, but it's not the case at all. It's actually Sweden. Sweden are the leaders in renewable transport in the world and right across Europe, with a renewable transport delivery this year of over 30%. That's incredible. You know, Ireland's actual real target or real result for renewable transport is about 4 or 5%. These folks are at 30. It's incredible. Now, they didn't start today or yesterday. They started a long time ago in this. But what I like about the lessons that we learned from Sweden when looking at their policy landscape, they started early, but as well, they looked to their strengths. They didn't look outward and look to see what other countries were doing with EVs or transport. They looked inward to the country. They looked at the resources they had in terms of forestry, pitch pine, land, ethanol, biodiesel. They looked at their industries, you know, Neste Oil, large companies in bioenergy and biofuel. There's no coincidence that they're Scandinavian companies, because they looked at the companies that were there, they looked at how to support them, and they looked at policy support. And that's sort of a clear message that really comes from the Swedish example when they think about renewable energy. And of course, Sweden have very little electrification of transport, but they will gain now over the next number of years by increasing the deployment of EVs in either passenger cars or buses or in light vans along the way. But most of the renewable energy in transport in Sweden is delivered from biofuels, both indigenous and imported. And again, they looked at their strengths. They looked at what they're good at. They're good at growing timber. They looked at the residues from the paper and pulp industry. They looked at different types of ethanol, and they also looked at their waste streams, and they looked at their slaughter waste streams. They looked at agricultural streams. And if you go to Sweden these days and you hop on a bus, the very likelihood it's a biomethane bus or some form of renewable gas fired or powered bus. So to close off, one of the things that we'd like to encourage people to think about, not only think about cumulative emissions, think about that electricity and bioenergy are still not enough, even if we do everything we can. But think about the strengths that we have here in Ireland. Think about the resources that we can go. Think about the problems that we have, and think about how renewable transport can tick a lot of those boxes, not only for delivering emissions reduction, but also for delivering job and for delivering a bit more industrial activity. And of course, as well at the moment, so having your own indigenous resources, be it biomethane or bioliquids or biosolids, that's a really healthy thing at the moment. Ireland at the moment is one of the most fossil fuel dependent countries in Europe, or fifth most fossil fuel dependent country right across the EU. And energy security is becoming a real big challenge and a real big worry right across the energy system, not just electricity, but also in the energy system. So encouraging your own indigenous growth, not only from things that we're good at, like wind and solar, but things we could be great at, which is bioenergy, biomethane, and bioenergy production here in Ireland. So Sean, I might leave it there and hand it back to you, and I'll stop sharing my screen, Sean.
That's great, Paul, and thanks very much for your presentation highlighting the main points within the report. I've just circulated a link through the chat to all participants of a copy of the report. I know some people were asking for the slides, but the slides are the replication of the actual report itself, a few pages from it. Just to remind you to submit any questions you have through the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen, and we have some questions coming through. Just before we go to the questions, though, I'd like to bring in and just have a brief discussion with all of our panelists. So if I could first call on Paddy to turn on your camera, and Paddy, are you there? Yes, Sean. Paddy, we can see you. Thank you, and thanks for joining us this morning. So I suppose, Paddy, you joined us this morning with two caps, your IrBEA President cap on, and also your CEO of the 3 CEAs. So do you want to just outline some of your own work in this particular area around transport, and then I'll ask you maybe to comment on the report in general in terms of your feedback on the report.
Thank you, Sean, and on behalf of IrBEA and its members, I'm delighted to see a very large turnout to this conference or webinar series this morning, and I'd like to thank in particular Paul for the great work that MaREI have done in completing this, and to the Transport Subcommittee chaired by James Cogan on bringing this about through the various sponsors over the year to deliver it. Like all aspects through COVID, it's been quite difficult to get large chunks of work delivered, but I think it's a testament to Sean and the team in IrBEA to bring this to pass. Again, another example of a very solid piece of evidence-based work, which will allow the industry to move forward in terms of pressures where required around policy and legislative changes that may be required, or most definitely are required, to assist us decarbonising the island of Ireland. I suppose, Sean, just with my Three Counties Energy Agency hat on, and our focus is particularly in the southeast across Carlow, Kilkenny, Wexford, and Waterford City and County. Transport is a biggie. In our own work, in terms of our own strategic review and stakeholder engagement back in 2020, we identified, as Paul alluded to, energy-related transport emissions account for, over 50% in each of those 4 counties, ranging from 52 up to 59% of overall emissions. So to cut that in half by 2030 is a significant challenge. And again, Paul highlighted that, emissions have increased in the last 12 months in the wrong direction, away from our intended target. So that tells us something isn't working. So to put that in context and looking at the opportunity that is there and the obvious need for a multi-pronged policy approach, not just an electrification one, 3CA, through its regional energy partnership program called REG Energy, have been working on a resource versus demand assessment across the southeast region. And it looks specifically at the different resources that could be available should policymakers and incentives be provided around the areas of bioenergy, right from biofuels through to biomethane for transport. As a natural ally to that can also be, diverted to heat. So it's very useful in terms of transport and heat, the 2 areas where we're making very little progress in terms of decarbonising. So that resource assessment identifies the potential resources, and then the natural economic spin-off, so jobs, rural enterprise, all of that money that we currently spend on imported fossil fuels. So when those boats come in, it's like a backload of Irish money is going back out with them. So rather than letting it back out of this country, the obvious benefit of letting it into the local communities in which it's produced, and the spin-off benefits in terms of cash in those economies to spend in those local economies on developing our own energy security. And energy security is something that people don't, pay too much attention to. But gas prices have hit records in the last couple of months. And we see the knock-on effect to that in terms of fertilizers and the agriculture industry. And when you analyze that, a byproduct of a lot of the bioenergy production, whole circles, sustainability circles, identifies biofertilizers, which would replace the fossil produced ones. And they contribute in no small amount to our overall emissions. So there's a multifaceted benefit. But just to summarize, we in 3CA and from an energy agency ethos always look at energy efficiency first. So, where there's a leak in the bucket, fix that. And Paul touched on that, not having a singularly renewable energy or renewable approach. And to that end, it's in the report there, the requirement to increase energy efficiency in the transport sector by 17% as part of the steps to the 51% overall emissions reduction in energy from transport. And to that end, 3CA have an ongoing climate action fund project called Greener HGV, where 1,000 HGV vehicles through a multiple number of fleets in the southeast region will be supported through innovation and technology around measurement and tracking and education, so specific education of the fleet operators and their drivers, and assisting them to participate in a reduction of a minimum of 10% in terms of diesel usage for the transport logistic routes that they're currently, and the payloads they're currently transporting. So it's supporting vehicles of 7.5 kgs and over. So LGVs are also covered, but they must be in that category of 7.5 tons in terms of weight and over. That's another aspect of how we can help to decarbonize transport. Yes. And really, to finalize that, Sean, 3CA is here to support, to facilitate and to, forge partnerships. And, when you summarize it, between bioenergy resources, renewable electricity, potential future use of hydrogen, although the economics of it and the round cycle efficiency of producing hydrogen for transport is still questionable, but needs more work and is ongoing. And then just looking at everybody using less. We saw the impacts of COVID lockdowns and a 6% reduction in emissions in 2020, directly attributed to lockdowns. So again, a lot of us are looking at the opportunities perhaps to reduce the number of trips and so on and so forth.
Okay.
Look, I want to thank you all again, IrBEA, and thank Paul for this really, really concrete piece of work, and looking forward with IrBEA and the Transport Subcommittee, to bringing this to the fore as it needs to go to see, finally some conscious and real supports around local energy supply chains, particularly around the bioenergy space.
Okay, just one concluding question, Paddy. If you were to make one call today to government or to our policymakers after this report after the publication of this report, what would it be? So just if you were to pick one particular aspect that they should focus on, would you care to have a stab at what that would be?
Well, from a policy perspective, I would like to see, a consideration around, the technology neutral supports around electricity production. Put, the bioenergy produced electricity at a disadvantage. So considering that is a particularly important aspect, because, and the reason I say that is, yes, it makes logical sense in terms of public funds and supports through the PSO and others, that they get the best bang for their buck in terms of what renewables they support. But by virtue of that metric, electricity produced from wind and solar will generally or nearly always win those competitions and those auctions and fill that capacity. But a lot of that capacity is constrained presently because we don't have the transmission or distribution networks to be able to cater for its production and transport and use around the country. So therefore, it's quite blinkered to put all your eggs into that basket, knowing that the motorways aren't big enough to take that, and particularly when offshore comes in the next 7 to 10 years. So there is a need to consider building a plan B. It may well be more expensive, but to that point, in the long term, 2030, 2040, 2050, it needs to be visionary, and it needs to be anticipatory around how to decarbonize. And Paul links that very well back to the Swedish model, and that graphic in the study, identifies that it's not just one basket that the Swedish government have placed their policy to decarbonize.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much, Paddy, and thanks for joining, and we'll bring you in a short while again for the Q&A. If I could ask James to maybe turn on your camera, James, and join us, and thanks as well, James, for taking time out of your schedule to be part of this discussion this morning. Could you give an outline, James? Obviously, you have your role as the transport lead in terms of the IrBEA organisation from a subcommittee perspective, but can you just give a background to your own interest in ethanol and biomethane, and also your own company's interest in this particular area?
Yeah, thank you very much, Sean, and thank you, Paul, for a very good report and an interesting presentation. Yeah, so my name is James Cogan, and I work for an Irish company called Clon Bio Group Limited. And we operate and own Europe's largest single-site ethanol production plant, which is in Hungary. And we built it just over 10 years ago, and the objective was to produce ethanol as a form of renewable energy for replacing petrol in the petrol fleet in Europe. So in the case of Ireland, we have 3 million vehicles in the fleet overall, but 1 million of them are petrol. Now, they're the lower mileage vehicles in the fleet overall, so that a third of the fleet translates to about 20% of the fuel used in Irish transport as petrol. And ethanol is a synonym for alcohol, and you can simply replace part of the petrol that you put in the car with ethanol, and that reduces the carbon emissions of the petrol because ethanol is a renewable form of fuel. At the moment, Ireland has 5% ethanol in its petrol. Most of Europe has 10% ethanol in its petrol. Some other countries have higher than that. The US has been on 10% for several decades. And we greatly encourage the Irish government to foster a transition to 10% ethanol in the petrol here in Ireland, which would be the equivalent of putting renewable fuel into another 50,000 vehicles, or and the overall ethanol contribution is the equivalent to say 100,000 or more electric vehicles in terms of climate emissions contribution. We produce the ethanol in Hungary from maize, and for every ton of ethanol we produce, we also produce food for animals. So we're a food as well as an energy company. And we spend a lot of time in informing stakeholders, so regulators, influencers, researchers, the industry itself, on how this industry works, how the ethanol works as a form of renewable fuel, how it contributes to climate action. And we encourage and we invite people to come and visit us. And, through this webinar this morning, I'd remind anybody to get in touch if they would like to visit. We especially are keen on people directly involved in regulation and legislation to come and visit us. And it's to inform them on how the whole thing works. I mean, over 95% of the renewable energy in transport in Europe is from bioenergy, from biofuels, and that it's even higher in the case of Ireland. Interestingly enough, in the last year for which we have data, which is 2020 in Europe, the contribution of bioenergy in transport actually increased. So overall, there was an increase in the proportion of renewable energy in transport. And there was a bigger increase in the portion of bioenergy than there was in other forms of renewables. So it's still very important as a replacement for fossil energy. And one of the reasons we encourage people to come visit is because it's also very dynamic. So the industry is changing very quickly. We're gaining efficiencies, we're diversifying, we're lowering the carbon footprint of the fuel in a tangible, substantial way every year, a couple of % a year, by reducing our own footprint inside the factory gates, and as the kind of upstream supply chain reduces its footprint as well. So that's I hope that's
good. Thanks very much, James. Yeah, and just if I could ask you maybe, and I'll combine these two parts together, can you just give us an outline of what the highlight in the report is for you, or what are the main takeaway messages for you? And then if you had to call, similar to the question to Paddy, what would your call be for immediate action from a government point of view? What policy measures should be immediately triggered in your opinion?
Okay, well, regarding the report overall, I think it's very valuable because it's informative for all stakeholders in climate action and transport in Ireland. And I felt we were missing some basic information, basic knowledge of the whole question regarding renewable energy and transport, and this report fills that gap. So it's a very good general purpose reader for anybody interested in climate action and transport. Regarding the the ask is it's a no-brainer. Go from 5% ethanol to 10%. I mean, I had a few asks. France is on 85% ethanol in its petrol. But certainly go from 5% to 10% immediately. And coming to Paul's question, discussion about the budgets, the later we leave the switch to E10 petrol, the lower the contribution that E10 can make in terms of Ireland meeting its carbon budget requirements. There's no point in us, as Paul said, it's not a question of doing nothing until 2030 and then suddenly cutting our carbon emissions. That'll be a good thing, but it's what we do in the meantime. It's like paying off your mortgage. You have to pay it every year. You can't just start paying in the last year. So a switch to E10 today would be very tangible, concrete progress.
Okay, well, thanks very much, James, and I'll bring you back in a couple of minutes because there's plenty of questions in there, so let you contribute as part of the response to questions. So I'd now call on Tony to join us on screen, and thanks again, Tony, for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us and for your contribution to this report. So maybe, Tony, can you give us an outline similar to the other lads? Can you tell us about your company, what you do, and the role of biodiesel in the whole transport mix?
Thanks, Sean. Thank you all. I suppose just a brief background to Green Biofuels Ireland. We're a domestically set company in the Republic of Ireland in New Ross. Y24TV72 is the air code. So unlike the Plum Bio Group, I suppose we set up our business in the Republic of Ireland. So our contribution, we employ about 40 staff here on site and 110 in the supply chain and haulage side of the business. We have produced 500 million litres, 500 million litres of biodiesel from waste oils and residues, all wastes. That's the equivalent of replacing 13.5 million barrels of oil, 13.5 million barrels of oil. We have contributed over 450 million in revenue in that period of time. And we have reduced on the island of Ireland CO2 reductions of 1.32 million tonnes. That's the silent contribution. Some people might refer to as the invisible electric car. I think Paul spoke about that at a previous presentation going back a number of years ago. The contribution is understated. We sell our biodiesel to the forecourts, directly to distributors and to the refinery here in Ireland. Overall, as I was saying, our contribution is understated. We're concerned, I suppose, from the point of view of the renewable fuels for transport, and the November document released by the government is a positive and ambitious plan. It has a lot of positivities in it. We see the biofuel mandate going from 11% to 13% as it did in January, and that's scheduled with step increases to 23 and all the way to about 38% GHG savings by 2030. Unfortunately, maybe what's missing in that contribution is that it leaves the blend walls. So we can't put any more biodiesel into fuel, into diesel, than 7%. That's a B7 by the car manufacturers. Now, for the 10 months to October 22, under the National Oil Reserves Agency and under the Department, Department of Decay, as I call it, DACCE, that basically that limit, unfortunately, we're at the wall. So if that doesn't increase, how do we hit the overall mandates? Is obviously a concern. So my wider view, maybe slightly wider than James's view, James Cogan there, was that yes, we would support E5 going to E10 in an instant, and equally the B7 biodiesel going to a B12 blend. We would see that as essential minimums. It was interesting, the analysis when we talk about Scandinavian companies, or whether they're Finnish or Finnish companies or Swedish companies, and there was a reference there to Neste Oil. It's interesting, we take about 30,000 tonnes of category 1 tallow, BSE susceptible material. However, there's over 90,000 tonnes of category 3 material, animal fats, non-BSE related, that unfortunately, while the Swedish team are far ahead, or the Finnish teams are far ahead, they allow that to be counted in their certification schemes, and all that is exported off the island of Ireland to save carbon in other countries. So that's always a debate, you know. So from that point of view, and probably to preempt Sean's questions, our request is obviously a review of the blend wall, has to be essential along with car manufacturers, and also that the government starts to play the green jersey from the point of view of going green. So if you want to go green, you have to take what were previously waste, which are now natural resources within the island of Ireland. We have to take those and say, how can we use those themselves rather than let them be exported, and rather than letting other countries avail of CO2 emissions that are fully ripe for our own use. To that degree, I would say there's a place across everywhere. There's a place in ethanol in Ireland, there's a place in biodiesel, whether from waste oils, but also I'd say there's a place for crop-based fuels. That's a personal view of mine. While we in waste-based, we save, and I got this accredited by Control Union in Holland, in Dutch-based, to see what is our CO2 contribution. Like overall, while we're here, taking in tallow, using energy to convert it into biodiesel, what's the impact? What are we saving? And independently, they came back and said, green biofuel saves 91% GHG. And that's an A-rated result. And 91% is excellent, and it's a good contribution. And hence, we see the savings in tonnes that mightn't necessarily pay for a bottom line, but there are huge contributions. Now, crop-based fuels have a contribution. They will save 45%. It is half, but they do have a saving. And I always feel an oversupply on the food side is always good in event of low crop yields right across the world. We all know we're going into issues with CO2 emissions, but we also know crop yields can vary over periods. So there's a place for all. once correctly, sustainably controlled, and once the sustainability and the international sustainability is high, and controls around that measure is vital. So yeah, I suppose the two things we ask for, we look for the blend wall and we look for sustainable feedstocks.
Okay, and I'll bring James in, and James, I'll bring you in after Teresa if you don't mind, because I know you probably want to comment on the crop-based, and we'll talk about that. If I could just make one follow-on question to you, Tony. In terms of the report itself, is there any other aspect other than what you have already highlighted or mentioned that you would like to mention as being important from your perspective?
Yeah, from our perspective, it's the blend wall, obviously present both for ethanol and biodiesel, as I said already, so I'm only restating what I said. And Ireland to play the green jersey from the point of view of finding sustainable feedstocks, natural resources that were previously waste are now a natural resource. There's no point in selling off all our natural resources when they're there to be used within the island of Ireland.
Okay. Teresa is next, and thanks, Teresa, for your patience in waiting to come in. So if you can tell us, Teresa, about your role within Green Generation and your company and what you do, and your contribution to the transport space from a biomethane perspective.
For sure. Thank you, Sean, and thanks for having us on this morning. So thanks, everyone. We are Green Generation. I'm a program manager for Green Generation, and we are a company based in Kildare that turns all types of organic waste, so food waste, agri waste, into biomethane through a process called anaerobic digestion. So the biomethane segment of this report is really important for us, and where we see, I suppose, the future of biomethane in transport in Ireland is certainly from the heavy goods vehicle sector. There's upwards of 150,000 HGVs on Irish roads, and I think maybe only 60 of them are gas or biomethane enabled. So we're really, Paul's report is fantastic, and it gives really solid reinforcement of what we know already. So we're already producing biogas and upgrading it to biomethane down in Kildare, and we really see the proof is in the pudding. You know, all of our HGVs on site are biomethane enabled. So really what we want to highlight today and going forward is the potential of the industry. You know, there's nothing worse than wasted potential, and that's where we want to bring the focus to what we're already doing. You know, not reinventing the wheel, looking to our Scandinavian cousins and seeing how they've done it, and really sort of, as an Indigenous Irish company, we see the benefits of it. You know, much like Tony, we employ 45 people down in Nerney and Kildare, and we really want to use the tools that we have at our disposal and really bring Ireland forward in emissions targets.
Okay, and Teresa, can you tell me just what would be the highlight for you from the report in terms of the biomethane area? What can you, if you'd like to pick one key aspect from it that's important to you?
I think it really is that potential that we have. You know, we are the only biomethane company injecting back onto the grid, and we also use it for transport. But I think in this report, you can see that there's an urgency, and there's waiting isn't an option in 2030. It's too late then. We need to act on what we have now. And in the last few months, we have had the implementation of the Irish Bioeconomy Forum. So things are going in the right direction, but it really is sort of, let's do it now. Let's not stand around and plan for the next 5 to 6 years. We have an awful lot of practical examples in Ireland, and they're on this call. So it's really about harnessing what we already know and getting on with it fast.
And if you had to ask, if there's one ask from you from a government perspective, what would that be in terms of developing and driving forward in terms of biomethane industry here?
Much like the rest of the panel people said, it's more supports and more awareness from government. So we're much like James, we would love for the department to come down to Nerney and see what we're doing, because again, the proof is in what we're doing. So it's already happening. It's already a practical example of what we're doing. So we can't do it ourselves either. It's sort of a chicken and an egg. Is it the government? Is it industry? We're ploughing on with other industry partners and trying to get it going, but there will be a hesitancy from HGV owners and transport companies to jump into gas trucks before there are enough filling stations around the country. So it's really a distance anxiety issue again. But we can see that it's growing by the month, which is a really positive thing.
Okay. Okay, well, thanks very much, Teresa, for your input this morning. And if I could ask everyone just to turn on your cameras now, and maybe if I bring in Paul and James to the first point, and I know, James, you might have wanted to come in regarding the discussion on the crop-based, but I think it's very clear in the report that our industry, our transport needs a mixture of waste and crop-based biofuels and bioenergy resources. So, James, would you like to comment on that, and Paul as well, in terms of, and that's highlighted within the report, or mentioned within the report?
Yeah, it's true that in the mix of renewable biofuels in Ireland and in Europe, there's a mix of waste-based, so derived from organic waste, so tallow and used cooking oil and others. And then there is crop-based, and we produce both, though we produce more crop-based than non-crop-based, so we produce it from maize. It's true that 10, 12 years ago, the life cycle emission savings of crop-based biofuels in Europe were around 50%. They're now upwards of 80%. I mean, on average, they're in the early 70s in percentages, and our own is around the 80% mark now, and we'd expect that to get to about 100% by 2030. And that's on the base. The progress is on the basis of some more kind of incremental efficiencies within our processes, but also upstream, and also carbon capture. So we're nearly at the limits of what we can do ourselves. The big steps we made in the last couple of years to reduce the carbon footprint, and these were very dramatic kind of world firsts, were energy recovery within the plant, reducing the amount of energy that we need, and then producing a lot of our own energy so that we're using our own biogas rather than taking in gas from the grid. And that's had a huge impact on our savings. So that, again, that's it, kind of illustrates why we think that influencers, researchers, and legislators should come and look and kind of do workshops every couple of years on the topic to see what the state of the art is. We're developing as quick as any other kind of high-tech business.
Okay, and Paul, would you like to comment on this particular point?
Yeah, I suppose really, Sean, like, I tend to look at the emission savings. Emissions matter most. It's not so much what type of fuel it is, whether it's crop-based, food-based, waste oils, vegetables, slurry, grass. It's the emission savings that matter. That needs to be our North Star for when it comes to fuels for transport, and that goes right across the supply chain for EVs, for heat pumps, for insulation. This is the way we need to think. And then when you think about emissions, that they matter, then certification matters. And this is why transparency and sustainability are really, really important. If you can do that, enforce those sustainability criteria and deliver real emissions reduction, then it shouldn't really matter where that fuel comes from, as long as it delivers emissions reductions that is certified, that's sustainable. I think that's the core element of the argument for me, Sean.
Okay. We have a number of questions in, so we'll quickly run through the questions and we'll bring in each of our each panelist on that. And Paddy, I don't know if you can turn on your video. Seem to be turned off, but so the first question there is, I think it's probably directly related to you, Paul. I think came in first and it came in during your contribution. Biofuel emphasis is, in my opinion, revolves, and this from an anonymous attendee. Biofuels emphasis, in my opinion, revolves around electric cars. Are biofuels that can replace diesel for heavy goods vehicles and heavy plant advanced enough? So,
yes.
Would you like to comment on that?
I think it's an easy one. Yes, yeah.
Tony,
you don't have to change the truck. You don't need a hydrogen truck or a, yes, you have to tweak the engine a little bit for CNG, but yeah, the fuels are there. Like, and thankfully a lot of them are drop-in fuels. So it's not like electric trucks where you have to wait for new technology, drivetrains and things to be developed. It's taking existing technologies but changing the fuel that goes into it.
Okay, Tony, bringing you in there because it is referencing diesel goods vehicles. So what's the opportunities for replacing that diesel with biodiesel?
Very much there, again, limited by the car manufacturers to a B7. But interesting, a lot of car manufacturers will have a B7 rating, say, in Europe, and that rating could be as high as a B20 from a diesel perspective in America. So certainly we need to look at the blend rates, how much allowed. But I agree totally with Paul in that there are plenty of alternative sustainable solutions gearing up both in Ireland. There's 3 factories now in the tallow UCO space in Ireland alone. So from that perspective, there's plenty out there.
Okay, next question, and again, maybe James and Paul, I could bring you in on this. How will the increased price of fossil gas affect developments in renewable transport? James, would you like to comment? Or
well,
Paddy,
certainly,
or Paul, anyone?
You know, the industry on the ethanol side of it, gas is an important element to the energy inputs. Now, for us, it's a bit less so compared to a lot of the other producers because we've switched to a lot of our own produced gas, so we're actually more insulated from external energy price shocks, which has made us much more resilient and profitable as well. And that's going to happen more and more. We've invested a lot in biogas in the last couple of years, building our own very large plant, and then buying and investing in several other plants, both inside Ireland and in other places. So yeah, as we shift away from fossil energy, we're less exposed to it. That said, energy price increases drive increases across everything, and yes. That's the same with renewables, unfortunately.
Teresa, if I could bring you in on this point, can you just outline for me, I know that fossil gas prices from a biomethane perspective help in terms of the economics, but obviously fossil gas prices can fluctuate. So can you just give us an outline in terms of the economics and what is required in order to make it economically viable to develop biomethane facilities and biogas plants?
Well, G and I have 4 gas stations at the minute with Circle K, and the comparative price of CNG certainly to diesel works out economically really well. It's just the CNG trucks do tend to cost a little bit more, but the price of that is folded in over the first couple of years. So in terms of people talking about fossil fuels versus a renewable energy, it's a sort of a moot point because we have to get away from fossils. I think that's at the end of the day, the price is going to fluctuate. It does sort of discourage people from jumping into using gas for HGVs, but that's something that we need to manage. And for us, much like James's company, we have our own supply of biomethane on site, so we've been able to harness, or we've been able to protect ourselves from that. But certainly, the price of a gas HGV, the cost of it over a couple of years is folded in. Okay.
There's a couple of questions in here, and again, just to remind you to submit your questions, and we will be going until 11:15 this morning. We usually do an hour slot, but this one, because we have quite a large panel, we've added the 15 minutes extra, so there is time for you to submit your questions and for them to be answered by our panelists. So a couple of questions here on the whole biogas area, so I'll bring in a number of our speakers on those. So in order to use the biogas produced, we need the heavy goods vehicle fleet to be able to burn it. Have you looked at the fleet in terms of conversion to biofuels? Trucks have a life of 6 or so years. That means that new trucks bought next year will need to be retrofitted. Is it enough to just have new biogas trucks when replacing old, or will we need to retrofit? So I think you have addressed maybe that point, Teresa, to a degree, but maybe if you just want, is there any follow-on comment you have on that particular question?
Generally, HGVs and biogas trucks or any vehicle, it can't be retrofitted, so you buy them in as a gas truck. If we look to our UK neighbours, they have upwards of 50 gas refueling depots. So if we look to the UK as a sort of a template for where we need to be, then the more gas stations we open up in Ireland, the more encouragement the transport sector will get from that. If you look at Virginia Transport up in County Cavan, they've backed this for a long time and they're flying it. So it really is sort of taking that measured risk to buy in at least one gas HGV and going from there. So the network will happen. It's just that we're sort of trying to push it on between government and industry.
Paul, would you like to comment on this particular point? Because your report is very strong on the whole need for heavy duty to go to biogas.
Yeah, and it's necessary, isn't it? You know, because we have to, and again, thinking of cumulative emission savings, thinking beyond cars and trucks and light duty vehicles, we do need to address heavy goods vehicles before 2030. We do need to start addressing them around 2024, 2025. So we need this type of action now. So economics kind of skew some of the thinking about this sometimes. But remember, economic arguments are taking us to a world that's 3 to 4 degrees warmer. You know, so many things we are doing. Electric vehicles, that's why we offer such generous subsidies, heat pumps, retrofitting. There is a subsidy element required that will be necessary, but that reflects the inadequacies of the current market system that we have. We're not putting a price on pollution. We're not putting a price on the harm that it's doing to our planet. So economics is only one part of the solution, but we tend to choose economic arguments if we mightn't like the environmental consequences, but we have to put the environmental consequences first. That's what ultimately matters.
Okay, I'll bring you, Paddy, in on the next question from Connor. In terms of biogas production, there seems to be a twin track approach between waste management and agri. In the two sectors don't collaborate. This contributor is asking, is he correct on this, and how do we change it? So maybe if you just comment on the potential feedstocks from a biogas perspective which exist, and is there collaboration taking place?
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Connor. I suppose in terms of biogas production, nationally, it's not particularly a busy space. There are, in single digits almost, active biogas plants, and those have traditionally been the benefactors of the old refit scheme, where they produce combined heat and power. So their focus is around production of heat and electricity. And right across Europe, we've seen a transition to biomethane production. And as Teresa has touched on, there are 2 or 3 sites in Ireland now that have biomethane compression sets in place to produce the biomethane. So again, it opens up that supply chain. But in terms of waste management and agri, the two sectors don't collaborate. At a departmental level, we are, age and old experienced about departments and having to deal with one and then go and restart the whole process with another. But just in any case, looking back even to 10, 11 years ago, an experience in visiting biogas plants in Germany, they must be retained very separate from a waste management perspective. So waste coming from non-agri or, agri residues, which we don't classify as waste, need to be processed in a different way to waste itself. So what you'll see in practice is, and it can be done, it has been done, and it is being done, the agri residue and agri, so biogas plants that are using agri feedstocks can be operated in their own instance and can be operated adjacent to waste reciprocal AD plants, but they have to be very much segregated under legislation in terms of fencing and wiring, and so there's no contamination from one to the other. So that's traditionally been the way, and in terms of feedstock, as long as they're not mixed, then my understanding is that they can operate quite effectively. So collaboration needs to improve, because with some proper management, I'd imagine they can be brought together into the same plant.
Okay, follow-on question here, and I'll address this to Paul. We need the agri-sector to change to biogas production. But this contributor believes that relying on individual farmers or groups of farmers to do this, it will not happen, that organisations with capital, knowledge, skills and capacity are required. How about we put the responsibility on them to produce the biogas? So if I could just make one comment on that, I think the challenge arises in that biogas production costs a lot more to produce than fossil gas. So it's about how we bridge the gap in terms of cost. I don't believe the issue is around knowledge, skills and capacity. I think it's about economics. But obviously, does that economics trump climate now from the point of view of your report, Paul? And what is required to make it economically viable? Maybe you might want to comment on that, but it is a key consideration.
Yeah, of course. And it's about policy, really, Sean, isn't it? It's about policy stability. That's what we see from Sweden. And that's what I find kind of frustrating sometimes with a lot of the kind of wider public discourse or political discourse that we have about bioenergy. We kind of pitch it as if it's this new novel technology that needs to be developed to some technology level. But it's there, it exists for decades. It's been deployed in many other countries. It's delivering real emissions benefits in Ireland and in other countries. But what's missing in Ireland that other countries have is that policy support. And as you said, the upfront costs for any renewable energy project are high. We wouldn't have the incredible successful story of the wind energy generation industry that we have in Ireland if we didn't have the policy there to support it. That wasn't about technology, that wasn't about people, it wasn't about industry. It was about clear, unambiguous policy that allowed people to put cash on the table and make sure that cast had a relatively small return on its risk. You know, that's what's needed. So I think it's about policy really. That's more than anything else, and being a bit brave with that policy, and also having a reliance on the science and the evidence rather than the ideology is fundamentally important.
And just if I could continue, Paul, in that vein, in terms of you, there's a lot of questions here about land, or there is a question here, and I think there's another question similar about land for grass, not including waste, as most of our food waste goes to Northern Ireland. But how many hectares would be needed to run our trains and buses, public transport on biomethane from grass? So can you just comment on the potential from grass and maybe the overall sustainability aspects which are always raised in this context?
Yeah, so what we did in this report, Sean, we looked at SEAI in their bioenergy potential resources, you know, and actually when we looked at grass, actually the potential is huge, but actually you don't even have to realize all of that potential. You just have to realize a very small percentage of it. About 2% of the agricultural land base is sufficient that would be adequate to grow grass to meet the needs that we've described in the reports. You know, now here's a personal opinion, Sean, and it's something that not everybody will agree with. I see a really strong role of land use and grass for particularly small farming communities, for cooperative movements. You might have, you know, 10, 20 farmers coming together. You might have farmers who are looking to, you know, de-intensify their herd, you know, maybe that 40 herd go down to 20, and use the extra land then available for biomethane production or grass production. I think it's going to be very, very hard for large farmers who are already very heavy in dairy. You know, grass is a premium for them. I think grass is probably more important to be fed to cattle for them rather than to digesters. So I think part of the story will come from farmers, particularly farmers who are looking to diversify, seeing biomethane as a different outcome, as not an additional outcome to what they're doing already, but changing their farm practices and dedicating land, instead of trying to grow fodder for 40 head of cattle, maybe for 20, and diverting the excess into biomethane. And when you do that, the wonderful thing about that is you've no land use change in Ireland. You know, the big debacle at a European level years ago was about potential land use change when it comes to certain types of a minority of biofuels. We don't have that problem in Ireland if you use grass that stays in grass that grows well. We might have to do a little bit of thinking about different swards, different multi-sward variations and stuff like that. But it can be done, and I don't think that the grassland issue is a challenge, as long as it's done as seen as a complementary revenue rather than an additive to current farm incomes.
Just a comment, I suppose, on that's, and just to clarify, that grass production is based on using digestate as the fertilizer rather than chemical fertilizer. I think that's a very important clarification.
Of course, Sean. Yeah. And that's important. And this is one of the, I suppose, sometimes one of the tricky things about when we think about biomethane production. You know, we think about growing grass and gas, but it's not actually about that. You know, as Teresa will say, it's about fertilizer management. It's about manure management. All of these things contribute to emissions reductions. And one of the things that we highlighted in the report, Sean, is where the agricultural sector gets a small bit short-changed at the moment. If you produce biomethane and it goes into a truck, the emissions benefit, of course, will be to the transport sector, not to the agricultural sector. There needs to be some recognition of that, because it's a holistic process, it's a holistic system, and there needs to be some way of maybe acknowledging or sharing those emissions credits with the agricultural sector to really drive and motivate the emissions reductions there. Okay, James, if I could bring you in, and again, we'll have quite a few questions to get through in a short period of time. So could I ask you just to be as brief as you can. In terms of ethanol production, it is mainly synthetic fertilizer used to help to grow, and if so, is the increasing cost of fertilizer having an impact on production costs? Is animal manure used as fertilizer to grow the maize to develop, or to reduce the carbon footprint? So would you like to just comment on that in terms of the production system?
I mean, we buy the maize from the farmers, and and it's grown according to, you know, the practices in the place that we buy it from, so we don't have any control over how it's produced. There are constraints on the maize that we can use, so it has to be sustainably produced maize according to the European directive on that. And as farming practices evolve, then that impacts our overall life cycle emissions, and as farming practices improve, so do the life cycle emissions of the ethanol.
Okay, thanks, James. Question for Paul, again, briefly, and thanks, Anya, for your question. Thanks for joining us. What is the solution to decarbonising our fishing fleet? So if you have any comment on that, Paul. You didn't cover marine in this.
Sorry, I don't know the answer, but Anya, what I'll do is I'll put in the chat, Anya, there's an excellent paper by my colleague, Professor Jerry Murphy, who did a recent paper on, I think it's called Planes, Trains and Automobiles. I'm sure ships are in their boats, but I'll post that in the side chat, Arnie, but sorry, I don't know the answer to that.
No problem. The next one is, will hydrogen not surpass biomethane as a fuel of choice for HGVs, Paul?
And again, it comes back to the maybe in the future, maybe in 2 to 3 decades time, but we need action now. It's not sufficient. Remember, waiting is not an option. It's not a strategy. So in many regards, it doesn't change what we need to do now. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. You know, we've had different perspectives on hydrogen. Some are very passionate and enthusiastic from the HGV industry, and some are very dismissive of it. So it's a contested view, but in many ways it doesn't matter, Sean. We need action and reductions now, between now and 2030, and cumulative emissions matter, and waiting is not an option.
Okay, another question here. I'll bring you in, Tony. What is the excise status of renewable fuels? Maybe.
Well, I can talk on from the point of view of the biodiesel, it's the same as fossil. The excise is the exact same number.
Okay.
We pay excise tax.
I can add to that as well, if I may. So yeah, Tony's right. The framework for excise duty on renewable fuels is determined by a European directive called the Energy Taxation Directive, which is under review at the moment as part of the Fit for 55 climate legislation for 2030. And it's going to be radically changed. Now it'll take another couple of years to come in, but the rates will be different for renewables. And it'll also be energy based rather than volume based, which is a big improvement.
Just to come back to that as well, sorry, Sean, just to say as well, the interesting side note there, back in 2010 with the introduction of the Energy Act 2010, open brackets biofuel obligation scheme, at that time we had to lobby that they wouldn't put carbon tax on biofuel. There was the Department of Finance were considering putting carbon tax on biofuel, and we had to lobby against that. So just an interesting side note.
James, I'll bring you in here briefly. James, the UK has opened and closed ethanol plants at the cost lower in Hungary, and which makes it more viable to run a plant there rather than in UK, Germany, or indeed here in Ireland. So I know you might want to comment as well on your interest in terms of investment in Ireland, maybe as well.
That's a very important point for the transition to renewables generally, because renewable energy is a commodity just like fossil energy, and its price is the #1 factor in determining whether or not people buy it, and competition is very hot, and so you have to be able to produce large volumes of it very cheaply, and the markets and the consumers are very sensitive to cost and convenience, and that's why biofuels are actually a very good tool or measure to take, because they're relatively cheap and convenient as measures for climate action. But within that, then there's competition between them, and the UK plants weren't able to compete against European plants, including ours. Ours is especially a good plant because it's very large, it's very recently built, it's very well built and very well run, and it operates in a low cost environment. So it has a bunch of things that helped it.
Okay, thanks for that. James, the next question, just a comment, and thanks to Kevin for joining us, CEO of Fuels for Ireland. And just a point, as a matter of urgency, the introduction of ethane must be mandated by government. All captive state fleets and those of semi-states should transition to the B20 diesel, which is already available on the Irish market. And Kevin, we're happy to discuss this further with you separately. But thanks for your attendance and also for your point. Paddy, a question for you. Would CNG be a good option to replace diesel fuel for depot-based fleets? Or maybe Tony, Paddy, I think it's addressed to, but Tony, you might want to comment. So would CNG be a good option to replace diesel fuel for depot-based fleets?
I think Teresa has touched on it already.
Yes.
It's widespread in the UK. There are 16 proposed CNG stations, I think about 6 of which are commissioned, ranging from Cork to Dublin to Belfast, interconnecting the ports in Cork, also the N7 to Limerick, Dublin Port, and the M1 to Dublin. Interestingly, with my 3CA hat on, the Southeast region is excluded from that under the 10T network historically. Now that may have changed. So we would, in 3CA, be pushing for CNG stations to be fitted around Rosslare, Bellevue, and other locations where HGVs are passing regularly. The answer is yes. If it's a high percentage of renewable biomethane, well, then it's low carbon. If it's natural gas, it would have a slight emissions benefit over traditional diesel, although I think the new Euro NCAP engines may be on or about par with CNG in terms of it.
Okay, Teresa, would you like to just comment on that as well, because it is relevant to you?
Yeah, CNG is still a fossil fuel, so you're looking at it's not as bad as diesel. There's about a 30% reduction in emissions there, but it's not really a comparison for biomethane, because you're almost talking about 100% reduction, because our feedstock is organic material as well. You're looking at almost over 100% reduction in emissions using biomethane and HGVs. So while CNG is good, it's not really as good as it could be.
Okay, Conor, you had another point there about giving the responsibility to the food processors to figure out about giving them biogas production targets. So again, that's probably a discussion for another day. I'm not sure how they could be mandated legally in terms of biogas production targets through maybe a renewable heat obligation scheme or something in that line, which the department have done a consultation on. A technical question here, and we're coming to the end, and sorry, we're going a small bit over time. How are the PM10 and Knox emissions for ethanol and biodiesel compared to CNG or LNG? So I'm not sure who wants to take that, or is there, it's quite a technical question, Paul or James or Tony. PM10 and Knox emissions for ethanol and biodiesel compared to CNG or LNG. And if you haven't the answer, we can come back to the person, it's an anonymous attendee that asked it, but we can come back on that.
I can comment on the ethanol. Now, clearly what we're comparing with ethanol is what are the emissions, the pollutants, the tailpipe pollutants with petrol, with ethanol in it compared to petrol without ethanol in it, because that's the kind of main comparison. You know, there's not much point in comparing to CNG or LNG insofar as it's not an either or choice between those two things. And I don't know the answer. Ethanol is a cleaner fuel than fossil petrol. And so if you burn it, it results in less tailpipe emissions and particulates, but it also helps, it's an oxygenator, and it improves the performance of engines and improves the combustion of the petrol itself. So not only is it cleaner itself, but it results in cleaner burning of petrol.
Okay, thanks very much. Tony, would you like to comment on this particular question, or it's up to you now if you want to come in on it?
Yes, the same as James. Again, in our production process, the biodiesel, the content of biodiesel with diesel from a distilled biodiesel process does improve tailgate emission issues. Those numbers, I think we'll have to go off and look at from the point of view of exactly what that is.
Okay. One of the concluding questions here from Shane: the current biofuels obligation schemes operate on the basis of a BOS cert being awarded for each litre placed on the market. What are the panel's views on the Commission's proposal to move to a carbon intensity reduction target with the removal to a large extent of double counting? So perhaps James, Tony would like to comment on that.
I suppose earlier when we talk about double counting removal, there's no issues with any change, policy change, once it's well flagged and you can prepare for the policy. Germany have had a GHG saving emission targets there for well over a decade, and they have a system in place to ensure compliance to that and security of supply around the sustainability of feeds. That's called an IrBEA system. We would certainly welcome it in green biofuels. As I said earlier, we're 91% GHG savings. So from that point of view, it's perfect. But we certainly need to know the detail of how they hope to transition. Because the last time we transitioned from a mineral oil tax relief to a biofuel obligation scheme, 6 months elapsed where nothing had occurred. There was no policy, and there was a gap in it. And we end up in that period exporting your entire output in periods where. So once the policy is clearly outlined and we get some more detail on it, certainly we welcome it.
Okay, James, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, no, I'd go with Tony on that. Yeah.
Okay, Paul, any comments on this?
I agree. Emissions matter most. You know, that's
okay.
That's what it's all about, isn't it?
Okay, just to summarize, we have a couple of comments in the chat. I just maybe mention a couple of them. And so Jerry says that hauliers feel that CNG have absolutely no future for HGV. So it's just a comment from Jerry. Colin. Question maybe for you, James: is ethanol production from forestry side streams commercially viable in Europe?
It's not. No, there are no plants. Sorry, there is one plant in Scandinavia, but it's small. And
okay.
Yeah.
Question in terms of from Benny. Hi all, great presentation. Bit of a technical question: does the digester still retain all of the nitrogen that it has in the feedstock slurry, so that it gives the same fertilizer potential as raw slurry application to land? Teresa, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I absolutely can talk to Benny offline as well. So we produce an organic digestate that gets land spread around our site in Kildare. And I have some details on that I'm happy to discuss with Benny offline.
Okay, and I think the anaerobic digestion process makes the nutrients more accessible and in different forms. So I'd also refer Benny back to a previous webinar that we did. I'm not sure of the number of it, but it's in our early series. We did a full presentation, a full webinar with one of Teresa's colleagues on this whole area of digestate as a fertilizer. So I'd refer you back to that. There's quite very interesting research in that webinar. It's in early last year, I think. Anne-Marie, just a comment, CNG is 66% less NOx emissions compared to diesel. And I think that's it. I think we've got all of the questions covered at this stage. I'm sorry if I haven't and I've missed any. I suppose we need to conclude as we've gone over time. So I'd like to thank all our attendees this morning. I would like to remind you of our webinar next week, in 2 weeks' time, which we will be publishing details in the coming days. I'd like to thank Paul and all your hard work and efforts in terms of getting this report to fruition. I'd like to also thank James from Bio Group, and also your work involved in getting this report together. Thanks very much to Tony for your contribution and your also input into the report, and also to Teresa for your input into the report on the biomethane area. And thanks very much to Paddy as well, our president, and indeed for all your contributions to the organisation. Finally, I'd like to conclude by acknowledging the work of Teresa O'Brien, who puts all this together behind the scenes. Only for Teresa, it wouldn't flow, and thankfully it flows smoothly on all occasions, and that it will continue to do so. So thanks very much to Teresa for all your time, efforts in advertising the events, our webinars, and indeed on all the technical aspects and ensuring they run smoothly. So thanks, Teresa. So I think that's it. We'll just say again I hope you enjoyed this morning's session. I hope you've learned lots from it. And the report is available on our website, and I did post a link to all participants or all attendees in the chat at the start. So thanks again. Stay safe and take care. Paddy, yes.
If I could just one final input, just to remind people, this work wouldn't have come about if there wasn't a transport subcommittee formed. And for those of you who are already members with an interest in transport, I would recommend you get involved in the transport subcommittee. And those of you that are not members who might want to get involved in the subcommittee, the route to that is to join IrBEA, become a member, and become active in that subcommittee. And reports like this are very useful and often very appreciated by policymakers in terms of a direction or steer, because they really do want to get industry feedback and reality of practice to support their implementation. So that would be just being a final note. That is the route to being a part of this great work that has been undertaken over the past number of months. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paddy. And on that note, we will conclude, and I wish you all a good day, and take care. See you soon again. Bye-bye.